This is a short discussion just to kind of wrap up what we've gone over with species concepts, give you a couple more additional just to keep in mind. We talked about the main three that you should know. You should know the biological species concept, the morphological species concept, and the phylogenetic species concept, which we're going to talk about here. Now, there are others and there are versions and different classifications. The Aldi Biani paper, there's some issues with it, but it does a pretty decent job of overviewing many of them. But again, just concentrate on those main three. If you want to do a fourth, just to kind of, I won't ask you about it, but it might be useful in the future. Look at his talk about ecological species. This is defining species based on the niche they fill in the environment and trying to use that as a unique distinguishing feature. It has some drawbacks, like many of them do. It also mentions phonetic evolutionary. These really are kind of subcategories or just different names. Phonetic's really a version, probably even a worse version of the phylogenetic species concept. Evolutionary biology, again, these are not really useful, but they're there if you want to take a look at them. But just be aware of those main three. And I want to spend just a little bit more time talking about this phylogenetic species concept. For many years, and maybe even a little bit today, people were still looking for a single unifying species concept. And many people, including Wheeler in the paper, that's 16.2. If you haven't read that paper, you don't need to read all of it. It gets a little bit theoretical and philosophical in the middle. But certainly you can read the first 2 pages and then read the conclusion, and that will give you just about everything you need to know. It's fairly good explanation of the concepts, that first and last part of that paper. So go back and read those, review those if you haven't done that yet. But this phylogenetic species concept, the drawback is you have to have lots of samples. So we might need many samples within a single species. But the advantage is it can help us to recognize when individuals are not completely separated based on their genetics. So this is a good example. We may have 2 closely related species that have very little morphological diversity, and then a third population with lots of diversity. And the temptation would be to say, oh, look, we got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 species. Based on morphology, they look different. So we define these as 7 different species. But yet, when we do a phylogenetic analysis of members of these populations, we come to the conclusion that because of interbreeding, they are not separated, they are connected, and we can't, even though in color they look different, we can't distinguish this population from the one next to it. There's too much overlap in interbreeding, so there's not a clear gap that would define that as a species. So it can be a very powerful thing, and the other advantage is it also can be applied to non-sexually reproducing populations. Now, in the paper, Wheeler leaves out one other kind of drawback of this concept, and that is horizontal gene transfer. Because when we have horizontal gene transfer, we get offspring that are basically fused, although be it maybe only a little small percentage from one of the parental lineages, but we basically fuse very distantly related lineages into a single offspring. So horizontal gene transfer makes it even more difficult, and phylogeny is in general difficult for asexually reproducing bacteria, but that doesn't occur very commonly in even the asexually reproducing eukaryotes. It does a little bit. But that process maybe is the only one that cannot be completely accounted for by the phylogenetic species concept. And so Wheeler makes this argument that this is the single unifying species concept, the really only one. And I think in the last 20 years since he's written this paper, that basically the idea is that it's very good. It's maybe the best, but still not completely independent of its own. It of itself cannot define every single species. And so we're left stuck with this, and this bothers some people, even some scientists, and they're continuing to work on it. But we're left with this idea that although for, pretty much as long as there have been humans, and even before, we are able to recognize most species, right? Little kids do this at an early age. A little kid can look and say cat, dog, and you don't have a problem despite the diversity of distinguishing cats and dogs. Now, there are species and cases where it becomes a little bit trickier, okay? But we recognize species as real units in the biological world, and yet we cannot come up with a single definition. So the short answer for this is, although the phylogenetic species concept is very widely applicable, it's still not a single unifying one, and there are others that are used. And so as a final wrap-up, and this is brought up in paper 16.1, this Aldebayani paper, one thing that, and this is actually most biologists would still agree with this, is that really we kind of need, at least if we're going to include all living species, we need a pluralistic approach where we realize that we are going to, maybe forever, and certainly for a longer period of time until maybe somebody comes up with a breakthrough, need a number or a group of species definitions to be able to encompass and define all species on Earth. So the real answer is maybe we still need to use more than one, even though some of them may be broadly applicable. And to some extent, I mean, there are special groups. So for instance, plants don't fit well into the biological species concept. Fungi have been notoriously difficult in some organisms, and so they've resulted to phylogenetic species concepts for definition of fungi lineages. So there are some notorious groups that it's hard to have a good single species concept for, but the vast majority of species fit well under whatever species concept you decide to use. If you want to use a biological or morphological or an ecological or phylogenetic, or maybe even some of the lesser known ones, you can probably define most species by any one of those. And then when there's an issue, say, okay, well, let's use 2 or 3 approaches and see kind of what the plurality is or the consensus is among those species concept. And that way we can still recognize the reality of biological species, and then to some extent reconcile, maybe not completely, but reconcile this idea that although they are real and they're important units in biology, we don't have a single definition, even after decades and decades of work, that can put a nice, simple barrier and definition between all different species.